Welcome to this podcast on the Boxer Uprising. I'm here with three fantastic students and a whole room of students who are welcoming us to the room. Thank you. For some reason, my favorite part is the applause. So I really enjoyed that, and they're real. It's not recorded, by the way, pre-recorded applause. Those are people actually in the room. Just by way of one quick little note. I think it was during the Olympics in 2008. I was at the old archery part of the wall in Beijing, and as someone who had done a great deal of research on the Boxer Uprising, I knew that when the 8 Allied forces had gone into Beijing, they were writing graffiti all over the city. It's very hard to find this graffiti. They wrote their names, the dates they were there, their countries, and just typical graffiti stuff. And I knew that on this old archery tower part of the wall, the old wall that's remaining, it's now an art gallery. I knew there was a section of, I believe it was German graffiti. And I was there with a scholar, and I was from this little old school at that time called the University of Alabama at that time, 2008. And there was, I believe, a Harvard professor there who was speaking with me about the Boxer Uprising, and I love Harvard, by the way, but this particular person was quite condescending at that moment. And I remember pointing out to this person the graffiti, and the professor was astonished that someone else knew of something that other professor didn't know. And that was a lovely little moment. I felt very happy about that. But there's such rich history of the Boxer Uprising. Let's begin.
Cool. Well, hi everyone. My name is Abby. I'm a senior theology and history double major here at Whitworth.
I'm Kian. I'm a secondary ed and art education major.
And I'm JJ, and I'm a psychology major.
And today we're going to be talking about the Boxer Uprising that took place in China in 1899, 1900. We're going to cover some general history of the uprising, including events leading up to it and its conclusions. We're going to talk about the way that it affected Christians and non-Christian people living in China together. And then we're also going to talk about the language and terminology.
Basically our first question and what we're going to dive straight into is the political and societal issues that led to the uprising. But I mean, before we get into the politics of the Qing court, I just want to I have a question about Prince Gong, and if he had not died, would the Boxer Uprising even had happened? Prince Gong was also known as Yixin.
Yixin.
He was one of the 8 cat princes in the Qing dynasty, and he was the most influential after his elder brother had died in 1861, when him and Empress Cixi took control over state affairs and staged a coup. He was very influential during the Taiping Rebellion and during the Second Opium War. He was known for embracing and promoting modernization during this time, but to an extent, which he had a lot of influence, but promoting this modernization caused conservatives and elites that were in the court to be conflicted and to have aggressive views towards him. But while on his deathbed, Gong advised his nephew, Emperor Guangxu, to be cautious about reformers that were coming up in the south, notably Kang Youwei and Liang.
Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao. These are difficult, but yeah.
And he was just warning his nephew just to remain vigilant against, as he put it, foreign intrusion, and how Western ideologies were coming into China. But why did he issue this warning? I mean, Prince Gong, he had a lot of firsthand experience with dealing with foreign powers. He had witnessed China's defeat in the Opium Wars, notably being defeated by Britain, the US, France, and Russia, which they had gained access to Chinese ports, and they had gained land at the expense of the Qing sovereignty. But yeah, Gong recognized that China did have a need for modernization, but he was trying to be wary of all the radical reforms that were coming through the Western ideas and through the radical reformers, as they're referred to in many different instances. He was wary of them because they could provoke instability, particularly in the Qing court among conservative elites, including his sister-in-law, Empress Dowager Cixi, who he had staged a coup with early on. But rather than outright opposing Reformation, he wanted to have a gradual, cautious approach, trying to slowly build in Western ideologies. And it's similar to how he had handled the self-strengthening movement in the 1860s to 1890s, because he was wanting to modernize China's military and industry, but not be fully taken over by Westernization. But he had ended up dying in 1898, and that removed the stabilizing force in the Qing court. I mean, basically in the Qing court, him and his sister-in-law, Cixi, Tai Ho, had gained power and a lot of influence. But later on, she ended up pushing him out of power in the Qing court and actually pushed him into a retirement. But it wasn't his choice to be retired. And then he ended up coming back, and then he ended up dying, which was kind of odd. But after his death, his nephew, Emperor, how do you say his name?
Guangxu, yeah.
Guangxu.
Yeah. Hey, good job.
Yeah, after he had died, Emperor Guangxu, his nephew, like totally ignored his uncle's advice, and he was trying to embrace radical reform. He was influenced by these reformers from the South, and he actually launched the 100 Days Reform, an ambitious but yet short-lived attempt to modernize and strengthen China's government, military, education, and economy against foreign powers. But these changes that he was trying to make threatened conservative elites who were fearing the rapid Western-style ideologies and reformations, and they were scared that it destabilized the dynasty that they were a part of. Most notably, yes, his aunt, Cixi, who had spent decades trying to, gather all the power, consolidate it for herself. And Cixi, she was born into the Yehenara clan of the Manchu. So she was a noblewoman. She was of the top class. And she had been in power because of that coup with the late Prince Gong. Just part of her biography, she had a lot of power up until her death in 1908. But during this power, she actually staged yet another coup. She's kind of obsessed with these coups, I feel like. There's an ongoing thing of like her just wanting the power all to herself, which, empowerment, but in a weird way. She ended up placing her nephew under house arrest after he had set the 100 Days Reform. And then she later executed different reformers like Tan Sitong. Tan Sitong. In just 100 days, the Reformation was crushed, and China's chance at state-led modernization was lost. And that's what they were hoping for through this 100-day reform. But the 100-day reform actually deepened anti-foreign sentiment, as many of the Chinese were blaming the Western intervention for all this craziness and chaos that was happening in the Qing court. They were like, why are these ideas just tearing our government apart? And that was combined with economic hardships and resentment towards foreign missionaries. But a lot of the public felt that all of this became fuel that led up to the Boxer Uprising, which sought to purge China of foreign influence, as that's the common theme here. And ironically, despite Xi's opposition to radical change in 1898, she would later align herself with the Boxers in a desperate attempt to rid China of like foreign influence. But yeah, after like examining throughout the Qing court and the fallout of the 100 Days Reform, it's crucial to consider what life was like as an average citizen. You know, because all of this in the Qing court is just happening for a select few. But what was it like in everyday lives, particularly with missionaries being in various different places, and many traders and merchants going throughout from foreign countries? First off, like missionaries, just in societal life, they've been a prominent fixture in the late 19th century. But with unequal treaties that followed the Opium Wars, missionaries gained special legal privileges, which allowed them to expand their work without interference from the Qing court or authorities. And these privileges, as we've studied in this class and seen footage of, was building churches, running schools, orphanages, teaching orphans through apprenticeship and to be craftsmen. They were allowed to practice their religion, and even in rural areas where traditional beliefs were at the core of society, they were able to share their faith. But for many missionaries, their work was not only religious but also cultural, as they sought to introduce Western values to institutions in Chinese society. As I said, like them teaching craftsmanship and trying to teach all these orphans. Which some missionaries supported reform efforts like the 100 Days Reform, but many people who saw these missionaries who aligned with Western ideals felt very attacked by them, because they felt like it was attacking the Chinese culture, the local culture. And they were kind of symbols of foreign intrusion for many Chinese locals. Missionaries often aimed to improve society by providing medical care, and their work seemed to be part of a larger Western agenda to dominate China. But yeah, I think all of this built resentment for many locals.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I really like how you mentioned Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, Emperor Guangxu, and even Prince Gong as these antecedents in this movement, right? Okay.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Kian. We're going to look at now, you kind of talked a lot about the government policies and the Qing dynasty and those ways that those things are kind of working out. We're going to look now specifically more at life during the uprising for more of your local people. So one of the first things that I'm going to talk about is like Chinese Christian immigration and like societal development that came out of that. So northern China, also known as Manchuria, had previously been pretty isolated from the rest of China due to the way that Manchu rule and the desire of like separating Manchu and Han people. However, as flooding and natural disasters plagued the rest of China, as in like the southern China, Han Chinese people began immigrating into northern China, which also meant that Han Chinese Christians started migrating into China as well, or into northern China as well. And so the development of Christianity in the Northeast is not just a story about missionaries converting settlers, it's also a story of how settlers made use of Christianity to establish local society. So Christian missions often ran like small, like quote unquote societies with specific governments, specific organizational structures, and as Chinese converted to Catholicism, they also took some of these social structures that came with them when they immigrated up north. And so that kind of also fueled like the way that fueled the anti-foreigner sentiment, as you have more you have not only Han Chinese people coming up into Manchu areas, you also then have them bringing Christianity, which perpetuates that frustration and that struggle there. So a lot also, in the late 19th centuries, many Western missionaries relied heavily on like diplomatic and military backing from the West, following the signing of numerous kind of treaties between the Qing and the West and Qing government and Western powers. The French in particular used this to their advantage to spread Christianity and French identity throughout China, and an attempt to quote unquote civilize the Chinese and make people French also perpetuated Chinese frustration at foreigners both in the north and the south. Do you want to talk about?
One nice thing about what you just mentioned, well, I think not nice, but important point, is that there were these, you talk about the French sort of what we often call gunboat diplomacy, right? We call that, the French call that the French protectorate. And they actually enforced China to allow anyone with a French passport to be especially empowered, to the point wherein all the other foreign countries had French passports because of the French strength, military strength in its presence. And this idea of civilizing, the French had their own term for it, la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission to make Chinese more French while making them Christian. Yeah.
Yeah, so going off of that, the view of some of the Western public and their view of the Chinese people is really important. Just to get some brownie points, what we were looking at specifically is actually Dr. Clark's book, China Gothic, which is a very, very helpful book to look at how the Chinese public were viewed, especially through the eyes of missionaries. So kind of the focal point of that book, China Gothic, if you haven't read it, you probably should. It's amazing. Is the focal point is Father Favier, and he really helps through some of the things that he writes to help us see how these Western people might view Chinese public without ever having been there. So some of the things that were given to the Western public that really shaped their views was these images with inscriptions about how the mothers of children would throw their kids into the street if they were girls, and just this view of showing them as almost savage people who aren't very civilized, really going towards that civilizing mission that many people pushed, especially some of the French. So this kind of seeped into some of the way that missionaries interacted with Chinese civilization. Going back to this civilized mission, that was a very big part of it. Some may have been there to evangelize, but these foreign powers are often seen as coming to destroy Chinese culture. Within these missions also, it's important to note the conditions of the Chinese public and how they were living, especially during this Boxer Uprising. They were faced with many dangers. So a good example of the dangers that they went through on the daily were the attack on Favier's cathedral. So 4 days before the Boxers attacked the city of Baitang, Beitang.
Oh, the church.
Mm-hmm.
Beitang.
Yeah, Beitang. Yeah. So the Boxer militia, if you like to call them that, the Boxers burrowed a tunnel beneath a orphanage, and that tunnel they put a landmine, which they actually detonated underneath that orphanage. The explosion led to multiple deaths of both sisters and orphans, and which this orphanage was right behind a cathedral, so it was mainly a direct attack on the cathedral. These landmines were pretty common in Boxer warfare, especially on sieges of Favier's cathedrals. An interesting connection that Dr. Clark makes within the introduction of this book especially is how the French church put pressure on the political and social state of China, and that may have been one of the leading causes for Chinese almost disdain of this foreign influence, especially within the missionary context. So moving on to this next sort of question is how did the conclusion of the Boxer Uprising impact the Chinese society and especially its foreign relations? So it's important to note that there were certain terms that were accepted, especially when talking about the conclusion of the uprising. So the official, let me backtrack. It's there was terms when the Boxer Uprising was concluded. These terms were given by Western powers to the Qing dynasty rulers of the time. So there's an official document called the Boxer Protocol, and it was signed in September 1901 as a peace agreement between the great powers and China. And outlines the conditions that the great powers of the time gave to China that were accepted by Emperor Guangxu, if I said that correctly.
Pretty good.
Some such conditions that were accepted was the complete audit of all officials who may have had some part in the rebellion, and specifically those who had direct influence on crimes committed against foreign governments. So the imperial edicts that were enacted due to these audits from these great powers, one of the edicts of 13th and 21st February 1901, led to the death of many of these officials, if not by execution, then by imprisonment, or in some cases condemnation to commit suicide, which was, I believe, seen as much more honorable. So this is one condition that was given, was this audit. Another condition, which was given by this 8-nation alliance, which I believe Kian talked on briefly, which is the coalition of Japan, Russia, Britain, France, the United States, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, was it was sort of a trade, I'm not sure how to word it, a trade regulation. So they prohibited the import of any weapons or ammunition into China, and this was done by these foreign governments. They made sure that these Chinese people, especially the Boxers, couldn't get any weapons again. They couldn't even import materials specifically meant for manufacturing weaponry. So these conditions are just a couple of the conditions that were enacted by the emperor with the hopes of bettering relations with these foreign governments. Due to this new established sort of hierarchy with the Western powers, China under the Qing dynasty was in a state of semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism society, which meant that while the Qing government still ruled, such as landlords and aristocrats who continued to hold power over sort of the peasants, its power was heavily influenced by imperialist forces. So the semi-colonial part comes from the presence of the foreign spheres of influence. So that's this sort of dynamic of a much changing time in China under this Qing dynasty. So moving into some of the reporting of historically of this event, some of the highlights and the influence of the control, like some historical accounts highlight the influence of controlling powers in China, and they use different terms such as the word rebellion, which isn't normally an accepted term when talking about this. In Western narratives of the event, the term Boxer Rebellion is used, which suggests sort of a violent, unlawful, and subversive act against those in power, which in the late 19th and 20th centuries, some Western powers viewed themselves as a civilizing force in China, as we talked about. Many were largely motivated by economic interests, such as we mentioned, a desire for territorial concessions and the spread of Christianity. From the imperialistic standpoint, the Boxer movement was seen as an affront to establish order, and it was an act of uncivilized behavior that needed to be suppressed for the sake of maintaining order, trade, and the influence of Western powers within China. So the term rebellion frames the Boxers as an enemy of progress and civilization. This perspective aligns with the dominant Western worldview of the time, which often characterized non-Western cultures as backward or uncivilized. As a result, the Boxers' opposition to foreign influence could be seen in a negative light to those in Europe and the United States. So moving on a little bit to the other side of this with these terms, most cases the event is described as a Boxer uprising within Eastern influence, or also known as the Boxer movement interchangeably. The word uprising is often used to describe the mass movement of people against oppression. The use of the term uprising suggests more that the Boxers were not just engaging in random acts of violence and xenophobic attacks against Western powers, but were participating in an effort to defend traditional values from foreign power. So the term movement further emphasizes the idea of collective resistance, suggesting that the Boxer movement was not an outburst of violence, but significant organized effort against foreign oppression. It implies a sense of purpose, and it elevates the Boxers from simply being rioters to being participants in a struggle for nationalism. For many in China, the Boxer Uprising was an early expression of Chinese nationalism and a rejection of foreign presence in their country. So some of that language and terminology can be taken in many different connotations. So technically speaking, the Boxers did not officially rebel against the Qing ruling power of the time, although it would have made sense for them to do so, as they were the imperious ruling power, and that's what rebellions usually go against, is the ruling power. However, the Boxers were primarily focused on removing Western ideology and influence, which is one of the reasons why Chinese Christians were persecuted.
Yeah, and so I'll go ahead and jump in and kind of think about the ways that we have interpreted, and the Boxer Uprising has been interpreted over time and been used by other political groups to kind of further signify and propel other political ideas that maybe aren't even connected to the Boxer Uprising. So one of those first things we can look at is the missionary response to the Boxer Uprising. And so roughly 200 missionaries, including women and children, were killed in addition to around 32,000 Chinese Christians. It's the math is hard to, the numbers are kind of hard to track, but that's a brief estimate. Chinese Christians and Christian missionaries were killed in China during the uprising, and these Christian missionaries were viewed as martyrs most of the time by other Western missionaries, with many missionaries located in other parts of China making almost pilgrimages to the sites where these Christians were killed, with some missionary groups going so far to like seek retribution and to seek out ways to kill the Boxers and take out the Boxers that harmed other missionaries in that sense. Another kind of also following that, following the uprising, as Christian missions continue to increase in China, and as people were, it was almost used as propaganda in order to recruit additional missionaries, and so you actually kind of jumped into almost a golden age of missionary work in China, as you have people coming in and really wanting to partake in converting and kind of evangelizing in that sense that is seen often in places where Christians are oppressed. Yeah. And so we kind of also just want to like conclude by talking about like the Boxers were used in like the idea of the new cultural movement. They were kind of put on to, used as a convenient peg on which to hang everything that the participants in the new cultural movement found objectionable and threatening about the old culture. And then you could also jump immediately into the Cultural Revolution and the rise of the CCP, and this movement also just used anti-foreign motifs similarly to the way that the Boxer Rebellion, to articulate frustration with the Chinese government's response to the Treaty of Versailles, which allowed Japan to maintain control over eastern parts of China. And so during this era, the Chinese viewed the Boxers of the past as patriotic and anti-imperialist, and were used as rallying points for movements. And so this shift is taking the Boxer propaganda in a completely new direction that is also helping to pave the way for the Chinese Communist Party. And so even what the Boxers were doing originally is not necessarily what they ended up being used for, and it's just one of those ways that like that language and the way that we think about history and past is able to kind of flow within cultures and such.
So what I love about how you all framed this, or how you all orchestrated this particular discussion, is you begin with reform movements, right? Kang Youwei, Liang Qichao, Guangxu, even Prince Gong, and, well, obviously Cixi. And then you moved into life during the Boxer Uprising, which was very interesting. JJ talked about terms, and then Abby, you ended with a valuable way of thinking about the interpretive frameworks of the Boxers that bring us into the modern era. That is, that there was a kind of usage of the Boxer era among communist parlance to describe them as, well, in their language, as a kind of proletariat, right? What a complicated topic, and I think you dealt with it deftly. We are way out of time, but I'm going to ask you a question. And my question is, who were the Boxers? The men and the women. That's one thing that I can't conclude until we at least say something about who they were.
I mean, in a lot of the stuff that I was finding, and this is hard because I mainly looked at the higher ups, but I think they talked a lot about how it was just regular people, and how it was regular people who were wanting to, or who were feeling either hurt, or they're like seeing their family members being quote unquote taken by different people, such as merchants, such as missionaries, and they're seeing all these I know we didn't get into it as much as I would have liked to, but like even the 8 nations and how they were taking over land, and
Right.
they were starting to build out so many like different ports, and they were wanting to go to wherever coal was in China.
Kian, good. You're mentioning the higher ups again, but then you mentioned something important: the common people. Let's call them peasants, right? Who were the female boxers and who were the male boxers?
I don't know the answer to that.
JJ, do you have a sense? You know, the fists of righteous harmony, right, being the male boxers. And what did they do? I mean, what did they believe in?
So I think it may be, as far as what they believe in, is it's this nationalism of China.
Well, there's certainly a nationalism, right? But in their practices, the boxers are martial artists. They're training in martial arts, right? And you have these two groups, the males, the Fists of Righteous Harmony, and these females called the Red Lanterns. And we can't conclude without at least noting these are peasants who believe themselves, you know, after these rituals, to be invincible to bullets. We're running into firing squads of foreign militaries, shooting them, and thinking that the bullets aren't actually working, but then, of course, dying. So, so there is this important on-the-ground history of these Chinese peasants who are forming into these male and female units and have an extraordinarily rich imagination of spiritual battles and sorcery, you know, Alphonse Favier being a kind of Guiwang, a demon king, and his sorcery helps protect the cathedral. So on the ground level, there are all these really fascinating things. But really, again, I love how you contextualize and place this into a lovely framework. Thank you. The class here is ready and poised to give us their appreciation. Very good. All right. Thank you so much for that.